Okay, well, thank you all for coming to this session. This session is entitled Photography and Intergenerational Understanding, and it's being presented by Fearnside. And I found out when I was going through the abstracts that were passed out that, you know, Lee is from my alma mater, so I want to give her a particular warm welcome to the Toledo Museum of Art and to the IVLA conference. Before turning the floor over to Lee, I would just like to ask you to make sure that you have your cell phones on either vibrate or turned off, so as not to interrupt her during her presentation. And if you have any questions or anything, or you need anything, you know where the refreshments are, I'm sure you all know where the restrooms are, things like that, please feel free to come and go as you need to. We have our room steward in the back, so if you have any questions, you can ask her. And I'd say without further ado, please just join me in welcoming Lee.
Well, thank you all for coming. I was afraid that might just be me. But my name is Lee Fearnside, she said. I'm an associate professor at Tiffin University, which is a small school about an hour southeast of Toledo. And some of the names on here, Gabe was my undergraduate research assistant for this project, and then Dr. Marie is a psychology professor consultant. And there will be plenty of time for questions at the end, as an hour is a very long time, so hopefully there will be questions. Many traditionally aged college students have anxiety about aging and negative attitudes towards older adults. For the first time in recorded history, older people will outnumber younger people, and by 2030, 13% of the world's population will be over age 65. Moreover, in the past decade, the median net worth of people in the U.S. age 65 and older increased by more than 25%. So these demographics suggest that it is in college students' best interest to learn how to interact positively with older folks. Colleges can provide opportunities for intergenerational contact, and studies have proved that positive interactions result in more willingness to engage with the elderly. Photography classes present an opportunity for interaction, and I will examine how a particular photography project may and may not contribute to shifting students' attitudes. So as we all know, art has both measurable and intrinsic benefits. So participating in art creation has an emotional stimulation and a possibility of sharing personal experience in a vivid way. This process could lead to an expanded capacity for empathy, which contributes to the creation of social bonds and the expression of a sense of community. In this project, it was done within an introductory digital photography course. Students had to interpret conversations with residents of a local nursing home and create subjective images based on their understanding of what they heard. For the students, anxiety about interactions with the elderly was reduced and their confidence about such exchanges was raised. This academic experience might help to mitigate fears over aging and encourage more interactions. So I've always been told, you have to have like a funny thing to get your audience warmed up. So this is a picture from the deep 70s of me, my father, and a friend after a long hike. Probably explain super grumpy expression on it. So inspiration for this project came from a couple of sources. I come from a family that values the oral tradition. My maternal grandfather would wrangle my cousins and I, all more than a dozen of us, to listen to stories. And my father would use stories as a distraction during long hikes in the White Mountains. Of course, he later told me that there were several occasions when he ran out of material before we reached the summit. So he was desperately trying to invent stories to put off the whining small kids. These childhood experiences of storytelling inform my own work and my teaching, as my work is often narrative, and I emphasize to students the power of images to tell stories about the world around us. Did anyone go to the Thursday presentation by Rachel Shelita about the dialogical model? Well, she was talking about engaging in dialogue, or a dialogical model, to have students and children react to contemporary art. Often it can be hard to use traditional methods of interacting with contemporary art to really gain understanding. And she was talking more about aboutness rather than meaning. And this idea of aboutness really resonated with me because it sounds more accessible and open-ended than assigning meaning, which is important in art classes at a place like Tiffin where there are no art majors. My project is also inspired by a discussion with colleagues during a faculty meeting. One colleague asserted that it was his job to deliver the content of his discipline, and that was all. As a practicing artist and photographer teaching art in a college setting, I see my job as not only teaching the craft of my discipline and fostering a student's capacity for developing meaningful content, but also encouraging students' sense of citizenship. That content and citizenship could work together and can include using their images to engage with others. And there are other disciplines that use this approach of connecting content with community as well. There's an ever-increasing, just I should say, as a note, all of the images, except for that one from 70, are all student work from this project, some of which I'll talk about specifically and some of which this one I won't. An ever-increasing body of work contextualizes this research. So ageism has been documented as common among traditionally aged college students. Knox, Kimuna, and Zuzman surveyed over 400 students at a large southeastern university with a median age of 19 and found that male students viewed people as old at age 58 and female students viewed people as old at age 62, so we're all kind of in trouble. Yilmaz, Kisa, and Langu surveyed almost 400 university students as well, and found that while the majority of students saw ageism as discrimination, the majority also demonstrated ageist behavior. And they recommended that integrating age-related ideas or projects into the student's academic experience would help to mitigate this behavior. Biggs, Hapala, and Lowenstein discussed the confluence of social and personal factors that must be understood to have real communication across generations. Wang discusses the results of reminiscence therapy and confirming some effectiveness in that therapy and relief of depressive symptoms. And similarly, Yamagami studied the effect of activity reminiscence therapy, researching various elderly groups, including those with and without dementia. Previously held belief systems can be difficult to alter, and the presence of commonality, identification, and internalization presents a significant factor in attitude change. This research suggests that even in a dissimilar other individual, a common event or factor can help to create interest, identification, and attitude change. Which in some ways seems like common sense, right? You find common ground, and then all of a sudden you can feel like you can create a significant, or not significant, at least real connection with someone. Commonality is the key element, and as individuals share ideas, greater identification is possible. Biggs et al. States that this is reminiscent of the real synthesis of generational intelligence. The opportunity to utilize art in establishing intergenerational communication and understanding should not be underestimated. This is a first step in creating new avenues in human service, both for the care of our elders and for occupational innovation and opportunity for younger generations. And these types of activities also become ways to foster improved relations between institutions like the university and local communities. I was talking with Carol a little earlier about Tiffin University. Tiffin University is a place that has grown exponentially in the past 10 years, and that has led to some real town-gown tensions. So having classes like this one go out and do positive, essentially, service projects within the community serves the university agenda of trying to make things better with the town as well. Photo Voice is a participatory social science research tool that uses photography to assist with studying different populations. Wang and Burris developed Photo Voice in 1997 with 3 goals in mind. They wanted specific communities to be able to record and reflect on their experiences, to promote critical thinking through discussion of images, and to influence policymakers. They used ideas from feminist theory, social documentary practices, participatory education, and critical consciousness to develop this method. Newell, Berkowitz, Deacon, and Foster Fishman used Photo Voice to have community residents describe the meaning and significance of the physical condition of their neighborhood. Participants carried cameras for 5 weeks, and then each week selected 3 images to write reflections on and shared those images and writing reflections to in weekly group discussions. And these group discussions provided the basis of their research on community members' perception of their own neighborhood. And this was a model that I really thought about when developing my project. Tiffin University is located in a small rural town in northwest Ohio. There are approximately 1,500 undergraduates enrolled on the physical campus, although there are almost twice as many enrolled in online programs. 60% of the students are on athletic teams, and 30% of the students are the first in their family to attend college. Tiffin University, like many colleges and universities, emphasizes community involvement. Students are required to fulfill a certain number of hours of community service, and faculty contracts include an expectation of community service in order to qualify for promotion. Building community engagement into the curriculum is one way to actively engage students with the world outside of academia and to connect the theories discussed in the classroom with real-world experiences. So this study took place in 5 introductory digital photo classes over 4 semesters. As I said, TU does not have a studio art major, so the majority of students enrolled in these classes were trying to fulfill their gen ed requirements or because they believed that photography was useful to their business or criminal justice majors. The traditionally aged college students interviewed seniors at local nursing homes and used those interviews as inspiration and jumping off points for a series of photographs. To confront student anxiety about initial interaction, class time was spent discussing qualitative ethnography and interviewing techniques. So this included a discussion of what qualitative research can and cannot do, namely that it can describe a time and place richly, but does not claim to show causation for the larger population. The class then brainstormed a list of questions to prompt discussion, following the general methods of qualitative ethnography. So they generated what's known as grand tour questions, and then mini tour questions and example questions that would all, in theory, feed off of each other to try to have meaningful conversations with the nursing home residents. These grand tour questions included, what is the most beautiful place you visited? Recall a childhood memory. How has the town changed over time? Tell us about the most important event in your life. All these questions were generated by the students. They were designed to prompt discussion about specific memories rather than generalized experiences. Students also toured the facilities before meeting with the residents, and they were able to work in pairs if they wished for the interviews. Students were required to write a sketch or impression of their interview immediately following it, and these sketches were the basis of the class discussion during the following class meeting. So hopefully you can see that this is a pretty structured project, at least so far. So in that session, the students worked in small groups to review the interview results and discover overlapping themes. These groups also then brainstormed how to translate these verbal stories into visual images. I presented examples of photographers who work with the subjects in kind of a consciously or semi-consciously ethnographic way, and it's ranged from social documentary photographers like Marielle Mark or Dorothy Lang, to photographers and artists like Wendy Ewald and Shirin Nishad, who incorporate text and interviews into their work. Students had several weeks to make photographs based on their interviews, and during that time there were several informal work-in-progress discussions, both individually and in small groups. They're using digital imaging, both digital cameras and Photoshop for post-production, although most of them are shooting on their cell phones. And they had a certain comfort level, but no real expertise. This is an intro class. I didn't direct them on how to tackle the content of the interviews, but rather how to connect the images aesthetically as they were meant to fit together as a series. None of them had participated in a project like this before, where they were asked to translate someone else's experience visually. When completed, the students wrote short reflection papers and presented a small selection of their images to the class during critique. The reflection papers were structured around a series of prompt questions based on that photo voice project. These prompt questions included, I wanted to share this photo with the class because, or what real story does this photo tell? Write a caption for this photograph, and how you describe this photo to your interview partner. The students then returned to the nursing home to share a selection of their photographs with the residents. So the research on this project, I employed both quantitative and qualitative methods. Pre and post-test surveys, each with 20 questions and using a 5-point Likert scale, were given to students to measure possible changes in attitude. The structured questionnaire was developed based on the findings in the LIFT review, and critique discussions were analyzed to discover student responses to the projects. I'll also talk about specific student images here in the context of the Visual Literacy Competency Standards for Higher Education as developed by the Association of College and Research Libraries. Okay, so this is sort of a small sample of the survey results. I have a few questions from the pre-test, and as you can see from the graph, and you can also see which definitely brings into question whether these quantitative results are even worth talking about. But anyway, that many of the respondents have a pre-existing close relationship with a grandparent. That many of them have social contact with friends who are younger or older, so they have pre-existing intergenerational contact. And the last pre-test question, that they work or volunteer in a situation that asks them to interact with many age groups. So although the literature shows, and anecdotally my interaction with college students also demonstrates, that they may demonstrate ageism in attitude and or behavior, many of them have pre-existing contact with people of different generations, which again makes sense. Post-test question. This I found to be an important one, and one that might warrant some further research. The idea that it's important to understand events through someone else's lived experience, so that storytelling is a way to transmit knowledge, and also suggests that empathy is important to understand history and the world. But, and again, this is not really very surprising, a strong majority of them said that even despite a project like this, they would still choose to socialize with their contemporaries rather than someone of a different generation. The quantitative results from the surveys show interesting results. The pretest revealed that students who have a close relationship with grandparents and other differently aged individuals are more likely to engage in this type of intergenerational contact in general. However, the other significant finding was that even with a positive experience, students are more likely to choose to socialize with their contemporaries. So in other words, a project like this is not likely to actually change behavior according to these survey results. In addition to the quantitative data from our admittedly small sample size, some of the themes from the group critique discussions are revealing about its impact. So the first theme was social anxiety or discomfort. This anxiety included fear of the conversations themselves, as well as fear about not having anything to talk about, or anxiety about hearing anything sad. Other statements included ageist overtones or fear of aging, including statements that students felt that nursing homes were places to die, belief that poor hygiene was associated with the elderly, and fear of talking with someone who had memory loss, or discomfort around wheelchairs or other kind of apparatus. This student said that his senior was very unresponsive until he shared that he was a music student, and then she revealed that she used to play the accordion, so they found common ground through common experience. And that's what he ended up basing his series on. So for some students, this project did seem to generate empathy. Several students said that the project made them think about elderly members of their family. One student said that this project made her think about nursing homes in ways she'd never had before. Another said that he wanted to visit his older relatives more frequently after this project. And then the reaction of international students was actually pretty interesting. One Saudi Arabian student commented on the different treatment of the elderly in his culture and talked a lot about, in discussions, had a lot more intergenerational households in his culture, and the idea of essentially shipping off the older members of his family was totally alien and very off-putting. Some students said that the range of experiences told to them in the interviews surprised them. One observed the similarity of today's online dating practices to the way the husband and wife that she talked to met each other through a compatibility survey in the 50s. She specifically mentioned eHarmony. Another student was emotionally affected by the sadness of her conversation partner at the recent death of his wife, and that made her think about her own romantic relationship. So these conversations did kind of trigger some kind of empathy or emotional response. Empathy was demonstrated in some of the images as well. This student recounted that her conversation partner used to like to sit at her upstairs window and watch the weather approach until her eyes got bad and she could no longer do so. So this student made a series of photographs from her upstairs window to share with the woman she talked to. This student was impressed by the romantic story of how her conversation partner met his wife, now deceased. So she recruited fellow students as models and recreated the story of their courtship. This resident told the student that she missed her childhood farm, and so he created a series of photographs of his family farm to share with her. When asked about the structure of the project, several students expressed pleasure at the opportunity to return to show their pictures to residents. One said that his conversation partner asked for the print and told him she was going to frame it and put it in her room, which she was very excited about. Another student said she felt sorry that her subject didn't have family nearby and she wanted to return to visit with her. Whether she actually did or not, I don't know, but she expressed that sentiment anyway. However, one student commented that knowing she was going to show her images to the resident made her censor herself, as she didn't want to remind her conversation partner of anything sad. And one student was particularly nervous about interacting with the elderly, and the suggestion she worked with a friend in the class calmed her down, and in the critique discussion afterwards, she said it wasn't what she had feared. So for that person, they might seem to have changed her attitudes. Several students indicated this is one of the hardest projects they had to do in their academic career because of the challenge of visually translating someone else's verbal story. So there are measurable and subjective results from a project like this. The surveys give a glimpse, possibly, into changes in attitudes and opinions about intergenerational contact. The qualitative data reveal themes from the students' experiences, but these measurable benefits are not the only one. So we can also talk about these images in terms of visual literacy. So students need to learn how to evaluate visual material, make decisions based on visual material, and create visual material that effectively communicate ideas. So as we've heard sometimes during this conference, we live in a visual culture. Academically, in the university level, however, we place an enormous emphasis on the written text. Many colleges and universities, for example, have writing across the curriculum or some other similarly titled program, but not many have visual literacy across the curriculum or even visual literacy classes. In a case study at the University of Montana, Ravis and Stark found that, quote, most college students lack recognition, context, and background understanding of historic news images. However, students tend to have better recall of emotionally charged photographs. They did a project in a freshman seminar where students read Sontag's In Plato's Cave and then held a series of discussions and assignments using photographs from the Vietnam War Memorial and an exhibition of Pulitzer Prize-winning photographs. This study revealed that the students were reluctant to assign meaning without text in the form of language, and that they, quote, they strongly believe that the captions provided the true context for interpreting the photograph in an authentic way. As an educator and an artist, that last statement especially I find particularly problematic. So I try to address some of these visual literacy competency standards using this project. So standard 4, for example, expects that the visually literate student can evaluate images and their sources. So some of what they're talking about in this is that they'd be able to actually do internet searches and understand what the value of the images that they're looking at and be able to evaluate their valid sources. But some of it is also about understanding the reliability or unreliability of images. So this student reported that her conversation partner talked about growing up on a farm, which most people did, next to a train track, and how as a child she would imagine that the train was taking her to exotic places. So the student in critique talked about using a subjective vantage point both to suggest fantasy and the size of her conversation partner as a child. Of course, this person really was a child. She'd be the smallest child ever in this train track. But, and she mentioned that she created this photograph with the idea of showing it to her conversation partner, as in with a specific audience in mind. Some students were very direct in their interpretation, and others chose to be more subjective or symbolic with their imagery. Those students who tried a didactic or literal approach often struggled more than those who chose a symbolic style, as they were looking to replicate places that no longer existed. Regardless of the approach, the very act of interpreting others' lived experiences generated some very empathetic imagery. So this student created this image after hearing a story from this guy whose child had died 60 years ago, and he was still very emotional about it. So he was trying to suggest, the student was trying to suggest that the empty swing was stand in for the child. Whenever it says anonymous, that just means the student chose not to have their name. emotional reaction to her interview experience, and she said that hearing about the resident's 60-year marriage made her think about her own romantic relationship. She made a series of images she called waiting, as her conversation partner had told the student she was waiting to rejoin her deceased husband in heaven. For the student, she didn't read that waiting as depressing, but rather chose to show the beauty of the world around her that could be found when waiting and sitting quietly. So kind of the aesthetic of the everyday. This visual literacy standard talks about creating meaningful images. This student's conversation partner talked about owning his own car wash business, and the student chose to photograph the subjective experience of a car wash, to try to show it as something other than mundane, but instead something, as he put it, magical and beautiful. The student felt that his conversation partner's pride in the business shifted how he had thought, the student, about businesses like this that he had taken for granted. This student said that the resident she talked with was unhappy at the nursing home, and this was actually one of the very few students who chose to make images about something sad. That seemed to be very hard for students to want to do. So this student used pattern and cropping and contrast to try to suggest a feeling of entrapment. Standard 3 is all about interpreting and analyzing meanings, although maybe I would substitute aboutness of images. And this series was made by a student who talked with a resident who had survived Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia. As this student had no way to recreate the literal interpretation of the conversation, she used images of destruction and decay she could find around the Tiffin area to suggest the woman's experiences during World War II. The student was explicit in critique about wanting her audience, and in this case she was talking about her fellow students rather than the woman from the nursing home, to see the images as a series and as connected, and only then, she said, would the images have the emotional impact she was aiming for. During discussion, the student said that she knew about World War II and Hitler from history, but hadn't really thought about an individual's experience of that time and place. She said that one of her conversation partner's most memorable statements was that to this day she didn't know how she survived. And the whole class was really affected by this additional information offered during discussion. So this interaction between the student and the resident, and then the student and the other students, made abstract past events real and personal for all of the students. There are definitely limitations to this study. It's a small sample size in a specific region, and during the group discussions, participating students may have self-censored and felt pressure to shift their responses because I was their professor. This research did not study the responses to the photography project by the elderly participants from the nursing home. And my analysis of the student images is informed by my knowledge of the students as individuals and by their experiences during the process of the project. I can see, however, that there was an impact on the students. The product that they created was not as important as the process they engaged in. And honestly, some of these photographs from an aesthetic viewpoint are not particularly helpful. But they represent something different for the students. As for significant attitude shifts, I would argue that a project like this should be part of larger efforts, and that lasting change happens with more sustained practice and interactions over time. As I said, plenty of time for questions.
Was there any interaction, or what was the quantity of interaction between the students and the people that they based their photographs on, looking at the images themselves? I mean, did they have any kind of interaction that way?
Yeah, after they finished the project and we had our in-class discussion, they brought their images back to the nursing home and spent about an hour with the residents talking with them about the images.
And how did they, residents, did you have any of their reactions? How did they react to the project?
Well, then, some of this is all anecdotally from what I heard,
yeah.
or from, that some of them were very excited, and some of them were very excited for different reasons. One, to kind of see people again.
Yes.
Some people were really impressed and amazed by what the students had done to kind of translate their images. Oh, I'd never thought of that, and I didn't think that what I had done was so important, or what I had said was so important, was one thing that one woman said. And some people, some of the residents were kind of like, well, whatever, that's nice, which I think was disappointing to the students.
Yeah.
But, so there was a range of reactions.
How did you select the subjects? How did you match the students up with the people in the nursing?
I worked with staff at the nursing home to think about, you know, who are residents who might be interested in a project like this, essentially, and who are available during class times.
So were all the
staff.
students traditionally of the same age, so they're probably, what, 19, 20,
Yeah,
maybe
19,
21?
20, generally 18 to 24 is traditionally aged.
Mhm.
And some of them, because there are many people who go to Tiffin University who are from the surrounding area, there were a couple of them that actually had relatives in the different nursing homes, but they talked to different people. So none of them talked with people that they had met before.
And you say that it changed the students. How willing were they to talk about their feelings in front of the other students?
Well, this is the final project of the semester. So by this time, they've had a series of projects that have gone through the process of having to have critiques and talk about their images. And that, especially for students who've never had an art class before, is a big learning curve. So by this time, most of them were willing and open to talk about their images. Some of them were not.
Was there critique between the students?
Yeah, I would say I mean, during the critique, did they talk to you?
Yeah, did they critique the other ones, you know, why wouldn't have done that, or what, I would have done this stuff differently, or something like that?
Yes, yeah, and really,
The stories?
from my objective, the critique discussion should be amongst the students with me as a facilitator.
Yeah.
So, all right, so I'm asking a bunch of questions, so everybody else jump in. It was, so what I'm curious about is, kind of the purpose of doing this project was, I mean, in some respects, on the surface, it's about the intergenerational contact, living somebody else's experiences in a way, you know, creating that empathy. Is there, in your conclusions for the class, was there any correlation to that and the student's career path, or how that was going to affect them in the workplace, in a work setting, or what they're going to do with the rest of their life?
Well, when they toured the facility, the staff person actually talked a lot about careers in health and human services. I didn't necessarily make specific connections in the classroom discussions though, which is an interesting idea. Other than when introducing the project, to talk about some of the demographic stuff that I talked about and the need for people to be able to relate and talk to people from different generations.
Right. Right, because, you know, the thought is, when you get out into the workplace, you're working with people of all different generations, and you have different experiences. The young person coming in, the person with no experience, with an education, you're put into a workplace where you have people, talk about multi-generational, right? We've all had that experience, particularly those of us who have now passed through many of those generations. You know, but it seems that it would be nice to make that correlation not only with visual literacy, but also with that experience you're going to have when you get out into the real world and you have to start interacting and working and being part of a team with people of different generations.
And it would especially make sense at a place like Tiffin University, which calls itself a professional university.
So this last year, the first time you did this project?
Yes, so I started it in the spring of 2013, and I've done it for 4 semesters.
And do you plan to do it again?
I think maybe one more time in the spring, logistically it's kind of a challenge. But it'd be nice to do it. The nursing home staff likes it anyway.
I think it's a great project.
I do too.
Yeah. I did something similar a few years ago, but we paired up, I collaborated with a radio station inside the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh. And we paired up 8th graders from a school with people from the community who were elderly. and had them interview them. And it all came about because we were looking for a way to collaborate through the arts with the radio station. And just wanted the thing, we were talking about that whole concept of listening to stories that people tell you. And I had said, well, I remember as a child, I would sit and listen to my mother talk to her uncle, who is my great uncle, you know, and I was just enraptured with the stories he would tell, and I'd be visualizing it, and I thought, you know, how often do children really do that anymore? Do they really understand the value of listening to the stories? And you have that up there, it's important to listen to the experiences of somebody who lived it. So we did the interviews at the radio station. We actually put together in digital format, and then made a magazine or a little booklet that, you know, told a distilled version of the life story. And we didn't unfortunately do any, we didn't do any quantitative to this work, but we did it for 2 years, and just listening to how the students reacted, it was, I would say, just looking at, there was really a very positive reaction to understanding how valuable it is to really spend time listening to other people, particularly those of a very different generation. And also just, again, the people who came in for the interviews, they'd say, oh, I've got nothing interesting to tell, but the fact that you lived at a completely different time period than these kids experience, and then they get to hear it through you, it's just invaluable. So again, you know, storytelling is one of the things that is linking this visual literacy, and I like that you're taking it from the other, you're taking the story and turning it into a visual.
And that, you know, even more than having to go into nursing home, talk to people they haven't met before, is the big challenge. So they have to figure out how can they tell this story or suggest the story at least without having a text. It's very, even though I'm very sympathetic.
They're used to taking photographs but not being.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what the reaction of the Children's Museum was to your project. Because you said it did it within the Children's Museum.
Yeah, it was within the Children's Museum, but it wasn't related. The radio station is in the Children's Museum, but is separate from it. But we actually, and again, I think Brian Kennedy, he said this in his earlier presentation, just before I came to this, was if you have a great idea, money will come. And that's what, you know, if you want funding for stuff like this, if you have a great idea, and this is a great idea, there is funding. People support this kind of stuff because it's multi-level, multifaceted, it's intergenerational, which is just fabulous. It's you know, it hits so many levels, and especially in terms of that visual literacy across the generations, I think is really important. And again, listening, when you said some of the older residents, their reaction was, well, they weren't equipped with the visual literacy skills that they might have needed to appreciate what this project was. So I would say if you're doing it again, maybe that's something to consider, that prime the elderly residents who are doing this, you know, to understand what they're being part of.
Do you encourage your students, maybe you touched on this already, but do you encourage your students to, with the idea that there's a lot of common ground between, you know, the younger students and the elderly, despite the different generations, there's differences in standards of living, difference in communication, but there's still a lot of emotional common ground, and that you could ask the elderly, you know, what was it like for your first date, or when you had your first child, that you bought your first home, what was that like? What was the anxiety like? You know, what was the worry like? You know, I think your students can learn from that.
We talk about that a lot when we're talking about how to generate questions, because the big challenge is to try to get specific stories, like what did you feel like at your first date, what was your first date like, rather than when I grew up I lived on a farm. You know, what does that even kind of mean? So we talk a lot about, and actually I started that conversation with some of those very questions, and I asked them to do some free writing. I give them their own, you know, what some of the ones I think one of the ones I used this past time, they could either do some free writing on what was your favorite toy growing up and what made it your favorite, or what was your first date. That's the first one. And it
there's some onus too, I think, on the elderly, you know, to look at someone at a particular age and to know what they're going through. Like, we work at the CVA, and we see kids walking in, and you can tell the kids that are from out of town that there's some anxiety there about being away from home,
Being in a big city.
or a bigger city or a different city, you know, so you can relate to what they're going through.
Yeah, I mean, I know my lib review stuff focused on the college age, the traditional age college students' experiences, but in prepping for this project, talking to the nursing home staff, you know, I know that her residents have a lot of stereotypes about college kids and millennials too. So although I didn't and don't really get into how this shifts the residents' attitudes, it's really would be interesting to know if they did. It's nice to make that kind of connection as well. The biggest complaint that I heard was, you know, college kids are always on their cell phones. I had that complaint too.
Well, it's interesting, one of your other questions to the students was, did this project make, do they now feel like they would want to hang out with somebody who's older, or do they still prefer their generation? I mean, if you ask the people who are older, I mean, really, you know, how many of us when we're 75 really want to hang out with somebody who's 18 and on their cell phone all the time? You know, but it's, did we increase the level of comfort between the two groups? You know, because you're right, there's a level of discomfort too with the elderly interacting with a teen or, you know, a 20-something-year-old. What do you have in common? But your questions were, those are great because they do provide the common ground. You know, everybody's experienced, you know, some beautiful memory or some tragic memory or, you know, love or whatever. Those experiences don't change over time. We won't filter it.
Right, they have different trappings, the emotions, the connection.
Exactly.
Well, thank you all. As I said, this was short and sweet.